Your expert is Sandy Niergarter, a professor of psychology at Bridgewater State University. Her research has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Behavioral Neuroscience, Cognitive and Behavioral Neurology, Cortex, Neurology, and Neuropsychology. This content is not designed for use as a medical reference to diagnose, treat, or prevent medical illnesses or trauma. If you have questions about the diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of a medical condition or illness, please consult your personal physician.
On the evening of March 12, 2012, I called my mom to see how she was doing. We usually talked about once a week. It was getting late, and I was going to wait until the next day to make the call, but I had an uneasy feeling that I needed to call that night, and so I did. The next day, my mom had a massive stroke. She survived, but she wasn't the same person anymore. Wasn't the mom that I knew. Physically, she looked like my mom, but mentally, she was someone different. My mom's stroke was caused by a blockage in a major artery that supplies blood and oxygen to the entire right side of the brain. Various areas of her brain were damaged, causing the left side of her body to become paralyzed. The stroke also caused her to develop something called spatial neglect, a condition I taught students about in my undergraduate courses, but had never seen before in a real person. Spatial neglect is typically caused by damage to the right parietal lobe, which is one of the 4 major lobes of the brain. Those afflicted with this condition only attend to things that appear in their right visual fields. If you extend your arm out from your nose like this, everything to the right of your arm corresponds to your right visual field. Everything to the left of your arm corresponds to your left visual field. Notice that what I see in my right and left visual fields changes as I move my head through space. Can you see how this changes? A person with spatial neglect can visually see both fields, but because of damage to the right parietal lobe, they can only attend to whatever is in their right visual field. They basically ignore anything appearing in their left visual field as if it's not there. So how can you see something yet fail to attend to it? Well, imagine you're watching your favorite television show and your spouse walks in the room, sits beside you, and starts talking. You know your spouse is there, right? You can see them and you can hear them, but you aren't paying attention to them, are you? All of your attention is focused on the television show. And then you get yelled at, right? So seeing someone and attending to them are 2 entirely different things. And you can easily do one without the other. My mom lived in Ohio, and I live in Massachusetts. After hearing about her stroke, I flew out to see her. She was still in the hospital on the rehabilitation floor. My sister and I wheeled Mom into a room with tables so we could visit with her. My sister was in my mom's left visual field. I was in her right visual field. As we engaged in conversation, I noticed that she would only look at me and not my sister. Even if my sister asked her a question, she would answer the question while looking at me. This is the moment I first suspected she had spatial neglect. My suspicions were confirmed when the nurses brought my mom her meal, which was served on a tray with various small containers on it. 3 containers contained some sort of liquid, and the others contained pureed meat, vegetables, fruit, and Jell-O. There must have been 8 to 10 containers on that tray. But my mom would only pick up and eat from the ones in her right visual field and ignore the ones in her left visual field. Being the experimenter that I am, I started moving the containers around. Sure enough, my mom consistently only picked up and ate from the containers in her right visual field. The paralysis and spatial neglect that my mom faced after her stroke illustrate the profound ramifications that trauma to the brain can have. Though the brain is an incredibly powerful organ, it is also a highly vulnerable one. Damage to it can change virtually everything about us: how we make decisions, how we process information, how we move, how we feel, how we speak, and how we experience the world. To understand brain disorders, we first need to understand a few things about the brain. The most basic unit of the brain is the neuron, a specialized nerve cell that allows the exchange of complex information. Neurons are found in the central nervous system, which consists of the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves that fan out from the spinal cord to the glands, organs, and muscles. There are approximately 100 billion neurons in the brain, and these neurons form trillions of connections with one another. Their cell bodies, often referred to as gray matter, can be grouped together to form different areas of the brain. In addition to cell bodies or gray matter, neurons have axons or white matter, which allow them to transmit messages to other neurons, allowing for the passage of information both within and between different areas of the brain. Localization of function refers to the idea that different parts of the brain are in charge of different things. For instance, we know that the primary visual cortex, which is located in the occipital lobe at the back of your head, processes information about vision. At the same time, these different areas of the brain work together to form systems. So, for example, the primary visual cortex is part of a larger visual system for processing visual information. There are three major subdivisions of the brain: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Each of these regions contains areas that are implicated in the variety of clinical disorders we'll be talking about in this course. So let's talk a bit about each one, starting with the hindbrain. This region refers to the back of the brain and is composed of structures known as the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla marks the transition from the spinal cord to the brain. It contains nuclei, which are collections of neuronal cell bodies that control essential life processes like heart rate and breathing. This is why injuries to this area are often lethal. The pons is adjacent to the medulla and contains centers related to sleep and arousal. It also contributes to attention and to aspects of motor activity, including reflexes and muscle tone. The cerebellum, which hangs off the back of the brain and is only connected to the brain through the pons, plays a role in motor learning, cognitive processes, and emotion. It helps to fine-tune neural programs for skilled movements, especially rapid, repeated movements that tend to become automatic. For example, playing a musical instrument like a piano or playing a sport like baseball, both of which require motor precision. People with damage to this area of the brain have trouble making precise movements and may walk with an uncoordinated gait like they're intoxicated. In fact, it is because of its impact on the cerebellum that alcohol makes it difficult for a person to walk in a straight line. Right above the pons, we have the division of the brain known as the midbrain. The midbrain contains structures that have secondary roles in vision, hearing, and movement. There are also several nuclei contained within the midbrain. One that we will be referring to when we discuss Parkinson's disease is the substantia nigra. This nucleus contains cells that release the neurotransmitter dopamine, and these cells degenerate in Parkinson's disease. Dopamine plays a significant role in movement, so degeneration of cells that produce it can result in a variety of movement-related issues. 3 of the brain areas that we've talked about so far, the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain, are collectively referred to as the brainstem. In addition to some of the nuclei I've already mentioned that are contained within areas of the brainstem, like those for heart rate, respiration, sleep and arousal, and so on, the brainstem also contains nuclei that contribute to anxiety and depression. Now let's shift our focus to talk a bit about the forebrain, starting with 2 important areas, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is pretty easy to identify because it looks like an egg in the center of the brain. Many refer to this area as the switchboard station. Information that is picked up by our sensory and motor systems, for example, our eyes, ears, tongue, skin, and muscles, travels to associated nuclei in the thalamus first before continuing on to more specialized areas of the brain for processing. For example, information from your eyes travels to the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus before being sent to an area specialized for processing visual information, known as the primary visual cortex. And in the case of sound, information from your ears travels to the medial geniculate nucleus in the thalamus before being sent to an area specialized for processing auditory information, known as the primary auditory cortex. You may have noticed that I have not mentioned the sense of smell. That's because smell actually travels to a part of the brain called the limbic system before making its way to the thalamus. You know how certain smells can immediately conjure a certain place, time, or event? This is because, in addition to helping process the sense of smell, the limbic system helps process emotions and memory. Right beside the thalamus is the hypothalamus. This brain area coordinates emotional and motivational functions, including sexual activity, eating and drinking, bodily rhythms, and aggression. The hypothalamus also influences the body's hormonal environment by controlling the pituitary gland, or master gland, which controls other glands in the body. There are 2 major subcortical systems in the forebrain. Subcortical meaning beneath the outer brain or cortex. These systems are the limbic system, which we just mentioned in relation to our sense of smell, and the basal ganglia system. Each system consists of different brain areas that collectively mediate particular brain functions. Some of the areas that comprise the limbic system are involved with the formation and consolidation of memories and the processing and expression of emotions. These areas include the cingulate cortex, fornix, hippocampus, amygdala, mammillary body, and septum. Meanwhile, some of the areas that comprise the basal ganglia system are involved with higher order unconscious movements, such as the starting and stopping of movements and tremor. These areas include the globus pallidus, caudate nucleus, and putamen. Both the limbic and basal ganglia systems lie beneath the cerebral cortex, or surface layer of the brain. The cerebral cortex consists of gyri, which are ridges of tissue composed of neurons, and sulci, which are crevices in the folds of tissue. These gyri and sulci can be divided into 4 distinct lobes: the frontal lobes, parietal lobes, temporal lobes, and occipital lobes. Each of these 4 lobes can be found in both the left and right hemispheres of our brain. Let's take a closer look at each of these lobes, starting with the frontal lobes. One area of the frontal lobes is the prefrontal cortex, which is located right behind your forehead and mediates functions like personality, decision-making, our ability to foresee future consequences, impulse control, appropriate social skills, and certain aspects of memory. How do we know this? Well, let me tell you a story about a man from the 19th century named Phineas Gage. A 25-year-old foreman at the Rutland and Burlington Railroad in Vermont, Phineas was very much admired and respected by the men who worked under him for being a hard worker, a great boss, and a friendly, caring person. On September 13th, 1848, while Phineas was working on the railroad, an explosion sent a long metal rod, called a tamping iron, through his head. This tamping iron was 3 feet 7 inches in length and 1¼ inches in diameter and weighed 13¼ pounds. The tamping iron entered under Phineas's left cheek, passed behind his left eye, and exited near the top of his skull. After passing through his head, the rod landed about 80 feet away from where Phineas was standing. Remarkably, this extreme physical trauma didn't kill him. His crew rushed him to the local doctor's house in town, where he ended up staying for a significant length of time. His recovery was pretty slow, and he had to fight off multiple infections. My students get grossed out when I tell them that the doctor could actually put fingers from his left hand in the hole under Phineas's cheek and fingers from his right hand through the hole in his skull and touch fingers inside Phineas's head. This hole did eventually close up about 3 months after the accident, although you could still see the pulsation. After he left the doctor's house, Phineas seemed physically normal, except for a small limp when he walked. Mentally, though, he was no longer the person he'd been before the accident, which caused massive damage to his left frontal lobe and most likely his right frontal lobe. Connections between his frontal lobes and the limbic system were also severed. Following the accident, Phineas appeared childish, obstinate, profane, and impatient, and he could no longer make decisions. He ended up losing his job as foreman, and in fact jumped from job to job for the remainder of his life. He died 12.5 years after his injury at the young age of 37. Though the consequences of his accident were tragic for Phineas, they provided us with important insights about the workings of the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex and the crucial role it plays in the development of both personality and decision-making skills. The prefrontal cortex is particularly affected in individuals who suffer from dementia, such as those with Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body disease, Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, and so on. Another area of the frontal lobes is the primary motor cortex, or precentral gyrus. This area mediates the execution of voluntary movement. Did you know that every part of your body is mapped onto this one cortical region? If you were to electrically stimulate different regions of the primary motor cortex in human patients, those patients would move whatever body part is associated with that stimulated area. Wilder Penfield was responsible for this map, which is often depicted as a cartoon-drawn homunculus, or little man. What do you notice about this little man? Can you see that he has unusually large hands, fingers, lips, and tongue? Well, the size of these body parts corresponds to the amount of cortical area devoted to those body parts in the brain. So why would parts of your face and hands have greater representation on this gyrus than other parts of your body? Well, if you think about it, we make more precise, detailed movements with our hands and face than we do with, let's say, our hips or backs. I mean, how often do you see someone completing a detailed task like writing with their hips? You don't. We use our hands because of their ability to make precise movements. There's also an area in the frontal lobes called Broca's area. Broca's area is part of our language system, and for most people, it is located on the left side of the brain. For up to 40% of left-handers, however, Broca's area is located on the right side of the brain. This area translates the thoughts we have into spoken words. Imagine for a moment that you were given the opportunity to meet someone who you find to be inspirational. What would be the first sentence or two you would say to this person? Can you repeat it inside your head? Maybe it is something like, "It is an incredible honor to meet you. You are an inspiration to me." Well, someone with damage to Broca's area can say the sentence inside their head, like you can, but when they try to say the sentence out loud, it doesn't come out right. It's as if their brain cannot translate thoughts into spoken language. Their speech typically sounds very halting and consists primarily of verbs and nouns with a lot of utterances in it. It may sound something like, it is a honor to meet you. You are inspiration me. These individuals are said to have something referred to as Broca's aphasia. Most cases of Broca's aphasia arise from a stroke. One final area in the frontal lobes that I want to mention is the primary olfactory cortex, which is technically located at the base of the frontal lobes and medial aspect of the temporal lobes. It processes information about smell. Once information has traveled from our nose to the limbic system and to the thalamus, it then goes to primary olfactory cortex for further processing. Now that we've talked about a few key areas of the brain housed within the frontal lobes, let's take a look at the parietal lobes. The parietal lobes house the primary gustatory cortex, which processes information about taste. But more important, it includes an area called the primary somatosensory cortex, also known as the postcentral gyrus. This area of the brain processes information about our skin senses, so touch, warmth, cold, and pain, and proprioception, or information related to the position of our bodies in space. Remember the homunculus we talked about, representing the primary motor cortex? Well, there's a homunculus for the primary somatosensory cortex too. And it's actually quite similar, with the face and hands occupying more cortical space on the gyrus than other areas of the body. Why? Well, the face and hands have denser concentrations of sense receptors and are therefore more sensitive than other areas of the body, like the trunk or shoulder. So what happens if you lose a part of your body, like a leg or even a finger? Is it still represented in the brain? Research suggests that it is, and that in fact, some reorganization is taking place in the affected brain regions. There's even evidence of reorganization at the level of the thalamus. This ability of the brain to change itself based on life experiences, like the loss of a body part, is called plasticity. Have you ever heard of a condition called phantom limb pain? When some people lose a limb, it is not uncommon for them to complain of having pain in that limb, even though it's no longer there. This makes sense if the missing body part is still represented in the brain. As I often tell my students, the sensation of pain comes from the brain. This explains why you can experience the sensation of pain in a body part that you've lost. When it comes to the temporal lobes, I'm only going to mention two areas relevant to this course: the primary auditory cortex, which processes information about hearing, and Wernicke's area, which is a part of our language system that is responsible for understanding speech. For most people, Wernicke's area is contained on the left side of the brain. People who have damage to this area are known to have something called Wernicke's aphasia, whereby they have trouble understanding others, and others also have trouble understanding them. Though affected individuals speak in a fluent manner, what they say doesn't make any sense. It's just a jumble or word salad. Most cases of Wernicke's aphasia arise from a stroke. Turning to the occipital lobe, this is perhaps the easiest one to understand. Put simply, it houses an area of the brain called the primary visual cortex, which processes information about vision. Now you know a bit about various areas contained within each of the four lobes of the brain. Did you notice that a lot of these areas start with the word primary? Primary motor cortex, primary olfactory cortex, primary somatosensory cortex, primary gustatory cortex, primary auditory cortex, and primary visual cortex. This is because these areas are where information first travels for processing after it enters through our eyes, ears, skin, etc., and reaches the thalamus. So where does it go after that? Well, each lobe contains association areas or cortices, areas that carry out further processing beyond what the primary areas do, often by combining information from other senses. We already talked about the association area in the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex. But there are two other important association areas worth discussing here, one in the parietal lobes and one in the temporal lobes. The association area located in the parietal lobes is known as the posterior parietal cortex. This area receives input from bodily senses and from vision, helping us to identify objects by touch, determine the location of our limbs relative to our body, and locate objects in space. Damage to this area, particularly on the right side of the brain, results in spatial neglect, the condition that my mom developed after her stroke. The association area in the temporal lobes is known as the inferior temporal cortex. This area plays a major role in the visual identification of objects. People with damage to this area, typically on both sides of the brain, have a condition called visual agnosia. Affected individuals cannot recognize objects by sight, but can identify them by other senses, such as touch. We'll be talking more about this condition later in this course when we examine head injury. Finally, I want to mention one other area of the brain, the corpus callosum. This is a dense band of fibers that carries information between the two hemispheres of the brain. Sometimes surgeons have to sever the corpus callosum in patients with debilitating epileptic seizures that are not responsive to medications. This procedure is known as a commiserotomy, and patients who undergo it are often referred to as split brain patients. In essence, their left and right hemispheres are no longer connected. It's as if they have two separate brains in their head. Studies conducted with these patients have helped scientists discover that the left hemisphere is more specialized for language and detailed or local perception, and the right hemisphere is more specialized for spatial tasks and global perception. We'll talk more about this research when we discuss epilepsy later in this course. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on the anatomy of the brain. Now that we've established some neurological basics, join us next time as we explore the field of neuropsychology and what it can tell us about the functional abilities of the human brain.